So the first learning objective, it's under cost classification, use for assigning cost to cost objects. Direct, first we will look at direct costs versus indirect costs. So direct cost is one that can be easily and conveniently traced to a unit product or another cost object. Guys, I know that you're writing down, so please, we will stop. I told you it's like 50 slides presentation because everything is terminology and concepts that we will use for the whole semester. But we will stop for like 2 knowledge checks. I will send you a poll in order for you to answer. So be very careful, stay very attentive. So direct cost. If we're thinking in a manufacturing setting, so if we're making something, the costs that are easily and conveniently traced to each unit of product that we are making, so the direct material that goes into the making each unit product, the direct labor that goes into each unit of product. So these keywords, direct costs, are going to include direct material and direct labor. When it comes to indirect costs, those are costs that cannot be easily and conveniently traced to a unit of product or other cost object. So examples of that would be manufacturing overhead. That's probably a new term for you. I'm not sure that totally helps answer the question, but when we talk about a manufacturing company, manufacturing overhead is all of the costs that go into the manufacturing process, but aren't really direct to each unit of product. So it's the overhead for running that manufacturing facility. It could include the rent on the facility, the insurance, the utilities, the property taxes, the depreciation, and I mean, the list could go on of all of these other costs of running this manufacturing facility or plant or some type of factory operation. And all of those go into manufacturing overhead, or call it MO. That's the concept, MO. Okay. Going back to this definition, costs that cannot be easily and conveniently traced to a unit of product. Some of you might just throw your hands up and say that, hey, there's nothing easy or convenient about any of this. Everything's an indirect cost. Maybe it's not the best route, but the point in here is that if we are capable of figuring out how much materials and labor go into a unit of product, then that's direct. And if we have to start doing a ton of higher math and allocating and guesstimating, then it might be an indirect cost. And as we talk about indirect costs here, they you know that included to support a number of different cost objects, and these cost objects cannot be traced to any individual cost object. So what's an example of that? So I listed some ideas of manufacturing overhead, like rent, utilities, insurance, property taxes, but we have also something called indirect materials. So that would be an indirect cost as well. So what's indirect materials? Well, it would be some type of material or supplies that are consumed in the manufacturing process that don't become an integral part of whatever we are producing. So it could be like oil used to lubricate a manufacturing machine, or cleaning supplies for a certain machine, something that gets consumed in that manufacturing process that doesn't become part of the actual object that we are building. So next, we need to look at our 3 basic manufacturing costs, and we've actually already touched on them. Let me show you. And it's direct materials, direct labor, and MO, manufacturing overhead. So just a quick definition of each of those. So that direct materials are raw materials that become an integral part of the product and that can be conveniently traced directly to it. So if we're making automobiles in automobile manufacturing plant, the radio installed in the automobile, and I put you a Fast and Furious car. Yeah, and we know that exactly what that is. And we know that there's one per vehicle, and we can easily and conveniently trace it to each unit of a product that we are making. Okay. So direct labor. Those are costs that can be easily traced to individual units of each product. So the wages that we pay to automobile assembly workers, the ones that are directly working on the line, making the vehicles. So whatever we pay those workers is direct labor for making those vehicles. So obviously there are other workers like indirect labor, and we'll touch on that in just a moment under Mo, but that's the message from direct labor. And we finally get into Mo, that it's manufacturing overheads. So manufacturing overhead includes all manufacturing costs except direct material and direct labor. So this is really a kind of a big cost bucket, if you think it for it that way. These costs cannot be readily traced to finished products. So let me read the first part again. This is important. Manufacturing overhead includes all manufacturing costs except direct material and direct labor. So if it's not direct material or direct labor, then everything else is Mo. So what are some examples? So this would include our indirect materials, which I just explained, like oil, grease, lubricants on machines. So it's a material and we use it up in the process, but it doesn't become part of the vehicle. So it's not part of the finished product. And indirect labor, how about the janitor of the factory? How about the floor supervisor who is not actually working on the vehicles, but is being paid to be there and oversee everything? And how about security of the facility? So those are all labor costs, but they are not directly working on each unit of the product. And therefore, they get classified as indirect labor and go under Mo. So until here, we're good.
You have a bit of a question. Well, it's confusing me a little bit because I'm trying to wrap my head around of thinking it as a cost and not as an expense. Because previously we used to talk about how cost is directly related to the products and expense might be rent, this and that, and the supervisor, the security, the janitor. Exactly. I would gravitate normally to thinking it would be classified as an expense.
Exactly. But guys, the important part in here is that you already know basic concepts of, okay, I don't care if you have problems to distinguish between a cost or an expense. That is why I'm gonna get clear in this class, okay? But the important part in here is that you can identify what is an asset, what should be registered as a cost or as an expense. And I will, in this class, we will get into what is a cost and what should be an expense. And maybe, probably, because that's what is MO, we have to consider as an asset. Okay? But you guys, you have already know, or you have the capabilities to distinguish what is what, no? And the question in here is just, okay, but what is an expense and what is a cost? Okay, just wait a second. We will solve that issue right in this conceptual and theory class and concepts and terminology class, okay? Just, that's why I don't need you to have for this class the open cameras. Let's move on to the terminology. Let's finish the terminology and In the knowledge checks, for sure you will get a lot of more clear picture, and then we can move on to Q&A. Okay? Marcelo? Thumbs up?
Yeah.
Good to go?
Yes, yes.
Okay, excellent. So examples of Mo. As we discussed briefly, depreciation of our manufacturing equipment, utilities, property taxes, insurance premiums incurred to operate the manufacturing facility, and the list goes on. That could go from manufacturing overhead, but the key is that it has to say depreciation of manufacturing equipment, not equipment of corporate offices. It could be all of these things, but it has to be for the factory facility or the manufacturing facility. And sometimes the textbook likes to slip in there something like utilities at the corporate headquarters. And that's not going to qualify as MO. These things are only MO if they are related to the manufacturing facility, okay? So only those indirect costs associated with operating the factory are included in MO. So anytime they throw in something about corporate headquarters or office that doesn't belong in MO, that's gonna go somewhere else, and we'll address that later. But before we move on from Mo, we're going to be talking about a lot about Mo this semester. We need to get a little bit clearer picture of what MO is and what type of account is Mo. That's a tricky question. I'm sure if we were in the classroom and I would hear you shouting out, it's an expense, it's a liability, it's an asset, it's well, we know that it's not income, but what is it? Well, let me help you with that. Mo is kind of it's kind of like an asset. It acts like an asset, it smells like an asset, and it walks like an asset. But so we are gonna treat it like an asset, but the answer is it's going to disappear before we get to the point of doing financial statements. But it's going to act like an asset, okay? Meaning that it increases with a debit and decreases with a credit. Everything okay, Marcelo? So it decreases with a credit, and so in terms of journal entries and T accounts, it acts like an asset. But again, I referred to it earlier. It's kind of a cost bucket. Mo is a giant cost bucket where we dump all of these costs during the operating period. But by the end of the period, we have to empty that bucket out. And we'll deal with where we are going to empty that bucket, okay? But you're never going to find manufacturing overhead in your financial statements, and it's not going to show up on an income statement or on a balance sheet. It's not on your statement of cash flow, and it's not on your statement of changes in stockholders' equity, okay? So it's an account that we're going to use a lot. It acts like an asset, but it's going to disappear before we get to the point of financial statements. So we will revisit that later when we learn more about Mo bucket and how to empty it. So next we have prime cost and conversion cost. And these are important terms for you to learn. It's essentially grouping together our three manufacturing costs. So if we take direct labor, direct materials plus direct labor, that equals our prime cost. And I think of those, the two direct as our prime input. So direct material and direct labor is our prime cost. And then direct labor and then manufacturing overhead are our conversion costs. So what we have to do to the direct material to convert it, so direct labor and MO are the conversion costs. So if I just add together prime cost plus conversion cost, that would give me my total manufacturing cost, right? But no, because we doubled continuing our direct labor, right? As you see, both are attached. One is attached, the direct labor is attached to the prime cost, and direct labor is attached to the conversion cost. So make sure that you learn this and learn it well. It's not super hard, but it's an important one to have in your brain. And later we're going to be doing some math problems, kind of a little bit of light algebra, guys. Don't worry. But so to use this terminology, so we'll get that into that later.
So teacher, there are like two types of costs until here. Like, what do you mean prime cost and
those are the
other?
groupings. Those are the groupings.
Okay, so there are types of costs.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Remember that all of this is terminology. I'm explaining the terminology. That's why I don't throw you just the videos and get to learn the terminology. I want you to understand it first and to stop in what you're not understanding. So non-manufacturing costs. So we know that direct material and direct labor and MO are manufacturing costs, and therefore everything else is a non-manufacturing cost. So we go back to selling and admin. So selling and admin costs, which you should be familiar with from financial accounting, are just going to be expensed in the period in which they are incurred. And I say that because that's a little different than MO. And I'm going to go back and talk about MO for a moment, okay? So selling and admin costs get expensed in the period in which they are incurred. We have to learn the matching concept because we want to match our expenses to the period in which they are incurred. So selling costs include costs necessary to secure the order and deliver of the product. They can be neither be direct or indirect. So this is what I was saying about these different cost classifications don't have to be mutually exclusive. So we've broken things out into direct and indirect manufacturing and non-manufacturing. So here we have a non-manufacturing cost, and it could be either direct or indirect. And administrative costs, similarly, they include all executive, organizational, and clerical costs. And again, administrative costs can be either direct or indirect. And those classifications about direct or indirect, meaning can we conventionally trace it to each unit of product? So for a selling cost, maybe it's shipping goods to a customer. So we know how much that costs and we can trace it to that unit of product. So that would be direct. Where we might have other indirect things like overall an advertising and marketing campaign that falls under selling costs, but we can't trace that to each unit of product.